Right, today I am near Swindon, not far from Lambourne, I've been told, with Jonathan Powell. Thanks very much for giving us some time this morning, Jonathan, to talk to us. No, you're probably the first interviewee of mine that's seen his work published in Chinese. So Champion's story travelled far.
It was published all over the world. I've got a copy just behind you there now in Chinese. Of course, it starts at the back. It was a fantastic story, and I had a ringside seat for the whole time when Bob first became ill to when he spent all that time at the Royal Marsden in London to saying he was going to come back and win the Grand National, which we all said, look, be sensible. Just if you can live, you'll be fine. He said, I don't want to live if I can't ride again and win the Grand National. He actually kept saying it, and unbelievably, he did it. It was the best day of my life. It was wonderfully emotional. And he has done so much for so many people in hospital from then to now. His own cancer trust has raised over 15 million. Initially, the money went on research into finding a cure for testicular cancer, which is what he had. They pretty much cracked that now. You'd be very unlucky to get it and even more unlucky to die from it now. So all the money's now going into research at his two units. He's got one in the Royal Marsden and one at Norwich University into research for finding a cure for prostate cancer. So his work is still going on, he's still raising money, and he's a beacon of hope for a lot of people who've been ill ever since he won the Grand National in 1981.
So from a career perspective, that was, you hit the ground running. Was that your first book?
It was my second book. The first book I did was on a lovely horse called Monksfield, which was full of improbable stories about Irish people. Monksfield cost less than £1,000. His trainer thought he looked smashing, Des McDonough, but in fact, he was a winder, but his front legs went like that, which is technically means that when they race, they won't be any good. Well, we know he was brilliant, and he won his first race on the flat, paying something like 650 to 1 on the tote. He then got beaten 13 times as a 3-year-old on the flat and developed into one of the great champion hurdlers in a golden age. Night Nurse, Sea Pigeon, so many good horses. And he won the Champion Hill twice, and he was second in it twice. I loved doing the book. They were brilliant to me from day one, Des and Helen McDonough, and it's so sad that she died the other day. She was a pathfinder. She was very much involved in getting female riders to be accepted, and she did ride a winner on him towards the end of his career, which was lovely.
Okay, just going back to, we'll talk about some of your other books as well in a minute. But Champions was used as the basis for the film. The book was used as a basis of the film Champions. Now that was big news. It says all over the world. Did it bring the riches that you'd expect?
Not really. What happened was that at the time Bob and I signed the contract with Victor Gallant's, he hadn't ridden for a year. He'd been ill, so they took a bit of a punt that he would recover and ride, and I had written the book with the last chapter to be the Grand National on Aldenete in 1981. Well, of course, he won it to everybody's delight, and then suddenly the last chapter became 3 last chapters, and they rushed it out inside a month, and it became a bestseller everywhere, and somebody eventually bought the film rights. But I thought they did the film pretty well. John Hurt played Bob, and the race scenes were pretty accurate, but for whatever reason it didn't go. It wasn't successful here, and it wasn't successful, more crucially, in America. I think perhaps people found the long scenes of Bob in hospital, being very ill, getting very depressed. I think they found that too harrowing. That's my only explanation for why it didn't work, because the story's true and it's wonderfully inspiring. So the answer is neither of us made a great deal of money out of it, but the story is as strong today as it ever was. And I put it on a par with stories like the great Douglas Bader from the Second World War, who people will know crashed his plane before the war, lost both his legs, came back to be one of the top Spitfire pilots in the Second World War, and was eventually captured and escaped without any legs from a couple of prisoner of war camps. I think it's that strong.
I had no idea that it wasn't a success, the film. I just always assumed it was.
Well, it wasn't a financial success. Is what you asked me, did we make a lot of money? No, not really. it was wonderful to be involved, and Bob is very committed to raising money to this day. And it's a great thing. Here we are, 42 years afterwards, and he's alive and well and enjoying himself, which is fabulous.
Now, as well as Bob Champions, you've written autobiographies of Paul Nicholls, David Nicholson, and Frankie Dettori. I've written autobiographies in inverted commas here. I mean, what are the mechanics for ghostwriting? Do you have to sort of sit down with a bottle of wine and a recorder and just let them ramble?
With David Nicholson, yes, definitely a bottle of wine. But doing Monksfield and Bob Champion's book sort of taught me how you should do it. My modus operandi is always to go and see the people, but also to go and see all their friends and colleagues to get different stories on them. I went to see lots of friends of Frankie, like Jason Weaver, and he would tell me things. And John Gosden was very helpful. And you get a different perspective, and then you would ask the subject, i.e. Frankie or David Nicholson, what about so-and-so? And with David Nicholson, the worse the story other people told me about him, the more he enjoyed the fact that he behaved badly. Frankie as well. Oh, yes, I remember that. He was great to deal with, but he's got a very short attention span, as I'm sure you've noticed. So I worked out that the best time to get him was about 7 a.m, out walking with the tape recorder running, and he's not listening to a phone and he's not distracted by all the other things that he enjoys in life. And he was great, and my wife Charlotte and I stayed with him for 10 days in Dubai, and we did lots of sessions there. He was lovely. He was really nice to deal with. I stayed with him sometimes in Newmarket. He's a terrific cook. He liked a bottle of wine in the evening, and he's very normal like that. And he found the discipline of not being allowed to have a drink and not being able to eat very hard in the last few years. And I think going to America and not travelling, just having to base himself in one place, is great for him. And it wouldn't surprise me if he keeps going for another couple of years.
And Paul Nicholls, how did that work?
Paul Nicholls has been a mate. Years ago when I was working for the BBC, I got to know him. He and his then first wife, who's now married to Oliver Sherwood, were both working for David Barron's. And she had a horse that was declared for the Grand National. And they both seemed to think they were going to ride it. So I did this interview with them about 10 days before the race, and they were arguing on camera about whether she was going to ride it or he was going to ride it. It made great TV, but unfortunately, for a reason I can't remember, at the last minute it didn't run. But Paul and I hit it off then, and he's just very straightforward and easy to deal with. He's extraordinary, really. He's been training now for over 30 years. He's as ambitious and keen. He's like a little boy in a sweet shop. Every autumn, he goes around his horses, and he just loves what he's doing. He wants to be every bit as successful in 10 years' time as he is now. He's got a great team behind him. They all follow him. And he's just single-minded to the point of obsession, but he's good fun well, and he's also extremely generous.
Now, all that sounds quite straightforward, but what about writing the stories of horses? I mean, where did you start with Desert Orchid? Did you start at the beginning, the breeder?
Well, I was blessed. David Ellsworth has been a mate forever. I think he's a genius. I think he's the best dual-purpose trainer there's ever been. He can be tricky. He could, as Mick Shannon would say, he could fall out in an empty room. But he's a genius with horses. I had friends who had horses with him. A friend of mine owned Rhyme and Reason, and I suggested he sent him to David Ellsworth. So David knows that and remembers it. Of course, he came on and won the Grand National. So I've been going to David various yards for many years, and he just is, again, a lovely guy to be involved with, and his stories are just sensational. So I knew him, I knew Colin Brown, I knew Simon Sherwood, I knew the owners, the Burridges, and what happened was he won the Gold Cup on that snowy, dreadful day when he got up and he beat Yahoo in the Gold Cup. And a publisher came on to me and said, could you do this? Could you do a really nice picture book? I said, sure. He said, when do you want it? Oh, tomorrow. So I did about 35,000 words in 3 weeks. And it was a lovely pictorial story of his unusual background. He was out of a hunting mare. He was by Grey Mirage, who was barely a miler on the flat. And he stayed all day. And he was just a wonderfully charismatic racehorse who captured the imagination of people. And
I was also interested that when we were, you gave me some notes before the interview that you said you tidied up a couple of books, autobiographies of Jenny Pitman and Patrick Veitch. I mean, how does that process differ?
Well, Jenny managed to fall out with the press, or they managed to fall out with her, with just about everybody, but I never fell out with her, which was quite a surprise to me. But she was great to interview on the BBC. When the cameras were running, she switched on and she was very good and forthright. And she rang me up one day out of the blue, said, would I do her autobiography? I said, sure. At that stage, I was working for the Sunday Express. It fitted in well. And I did lots of interviews and then had written about 5 chapters, and suddenly the Express became 7 days a week. So not only was I working for the Sunday, I was working for the Daily. And it soon became clear I didn't really have the time to devote to doing Jenny justice. So I rang her up, thought she'd explode, but she understood. And she got 2 or 3 other people to finish it. And then I left the Express, and she heard about it and rang me and said, could you, look, I've got to a certain point, can you finish it? So she sent me what had been done, and I tidied it up and added 3 more chapters. She was a good story, Jenny. I mean, punchy.
And what about Patrick Veitch?
Much the same. He contacted me out of the blue. I was aware of him. I'd met him once. I didn't know the half of it. I didn't know he had to go into hiding when he was threatened by a guy who was threatening to do away with him. And again, he had written it himself. And I tidied it up. And I found that very messy. I like to start from scratch with a blank sheet of paper. If you start with something that's already been written by somebody else, it's painstaking. But I tidied it up, and he was pretty happy with it. And his story is fascinating. I'm not sure we got all the true stories about him, but he's a fascinating guy who found a way of making serious bucks as a punter and getting on. And of course, that's the key bit, as you understand. Getting on is the difficulty now.
Now, Patrick's a feared professional punter, but you've had some success in that sphere yourself.
Well, I was never a professional, but I was lucky enough to be very close to it. And I've had some great touches. The best one was on Nashwan in the Derby. I backed him after he won it as a 2-year-old at Ascot. And then I heard about that. I backed him for the Derby the previous year, and then we heard about this sensational gallop at West Ilsley on one Saturday morning. It was the morning of the Greenham, I think. And suddenly he was being backed for the Guineas. It never occurred to me that he was a Guineas horse. No, I don't think it occurred to them. But as you know, he won this gallop by 100 yards, and they decided he was going to go for the Guineas as well. And I piled on. I managed to get a few quid on, not much, at 33 for the Guineas, and it just collapsed. And of course, he won the Guineas and then won the Derby, and that paid for the conservatory here. But I'm not a professional, never have been. I haven't been brave enough. But I did have a lovely touch in the Jackpot in 1993. It was on Cambridgeshire Day, and funnily enough, I was working at Chepstow that day for the BBC, but I suggested to a chum we did it. He's a QC, and funnily enough, he later was employed by the BHA until recently as an appeal judge. He said, look, you do the work and we'll go halves. Well, it was a huge jackpot, so we did it to 10p. So we laid out about £100 each at 10p, and it paid to £1 273,000. So we split 27,000. And it was a typical tricky jackpot. Cambridgeshire was a hard race. There was an impossible handicap in the first race. And the other races weren't that tricky. They were conditioned races, so you had a chance that the first or second favourite would win. And where we got lucky, I think we put 10 in the first race, and that was won by a 25 to 1 shot. He was in there, and we had the winner of the Cambridgeshire, which was favourite on the day, 7 to 1. The other ones weren't that difficult. So it was getting through that first race, and we got lucky.